It's an honor to introduce to you our first keynote speaker of this conference, our next speaker, I want to say. Professor Dr. Andrew Scull. He's a distinguished professor in sociology at the University of California, San Diego. And he has authored more than 15 books on the history of psychiatry. A well-known book is Madness in Civilization. He has held several fellowships. He won awards for his lifelong contribution to the history of medicine and the history of psychiatry. And he has published in major journals in medicine, psychiatry, law, sociology, and also has written extensively on psychiatry for the more general audience. Interestingly, we spoke yesterday, he has traveled a lot, but he also lived in many places in the world. He was born in Scotland, he was raised in Africa, then moved to the UK, studied in Oxford, and after meeting his future wife, he moved finally to the United States. So he has seen a lot, and I believe we can learn also a lot of your views. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Andrew Scull.
Thank you, Birgit. I thought you were doing that in Dutch. Well, thank you, everybody. It's an enormous pleasure to be here and on the occasion of such an auspicious anniversary for the Dutch profession of psychiatry. I'm going to be talking mostly about the more distant past today. If I can prevail on you long enough, I may end up around the asylum era, which is the period which gives birth to modern psychiatry. But for the most part, I'm going to talk about earlier periods. And some of the language I'm going to be using, particularly the word madness and perhaps occasionally the word mad doctor, which is what psychiatrists were once called, will be a little disturbing. So forgive me, because that's the language of the time. And as a historian, I try to reflect the sensibilities of the people I'm talking about rather than our modern way of looking at things. So my book, Madness in Civilization, which I think is what provoked the association to ask me to come today, tries to look at how madness or mental illness has been regarded and responded to over perhaps a bit more than 2,000 years. And to attempt that within the covers of a single book is obviously an exercise in extreme chutzpah. And to then distill that down to 30 minutes addressing you is absurd. So I'm going to concentrate on a very few themes, mostly centering around the question of the various meanings that societies have attached to mental illness over the course of many centuries. I think it's fair to say that modern science and massive research programs in your profession worldwide still leave the etiology of our schizophrenias and our bipolar disorders rather uncertain and mysterious. And if that's true of us today, imagine for our remote ancestors the problem of how to account for and to cope with the depredations of madness must have seemed absolutely daunting. Baffled by its presence, they often sought solace and explanation in the realm of the supernatural. The wrath of God or of gods, possession by the devil or by evil spirits, bewitchment, perhaps the astrological influence of misaligned stars, sometimes even divine blessing or holy madness, because perverse as it might seem, some forms of madness were seen in a relatively favorable light. We getting some? Yeah. So madness surfaces repeatedly in religious texts and in practices. In the Hebrew Bible, it's really replete with stories of people who are bereft of their wits, raving or frenzied or thrust into the depths of melancholy and despair. My first image here reflects a story in the book of Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar has laid waste to Jerusalem and destroyed its temple, and he loses sight, according to the Bible, of who the real ruler is. And in the midst of his boasts about his accomplishments, God teaches him the necessary lesson by reducing him to a bestial form of madness. As we learn from a clay tablet which is preserved in the British Museum has stolen things from all over the world. For 7 long years, quote, his life appeared of no value to him. He didn't love his son or daughter. Family and clan did not exist for him. Or, in the biblical version, let his heart be altered from that of a man, and let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 seasons pass over him. And you see him there. There are many images of Nebuchadnezzar in this state. In the book of Samuel, Saul, the king of the Jews, rebels against God, failing to carry out to the letter the orders he's been given to slaughter the Amalek, a rival tribe, both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass, and spare them not. Putin seems to be borrowing that notion these days. Anyway, he destroys most of the people, but he spares the king, and he spares the best sheep and oxen and lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. Accordingly, Samuel says to him that because of his defiance of God, he's going to be punished. And the Spirit of the Lord, we're told, departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. This is a tormented Samuel. This is David playing the harp, music trying to soothe the maddened breast. And Saul is about to launch a spear at him, and David runs away quite sensibly. By turns fearful, raging, homicidal, deeply melancholic, Saul languished for the rest of his rule in a state of immense mental turmoil, ending only, as we see in this picture, the extreme left-hand side, as you're looking at it. He's facing certain defeat on the battlefield, and presumably that's because of continued divine displeasure, and he kills himself. In the Bible, prophets and mystics might alternately be regarded as intensely religious or as mad. Indeed, as the historian George Rosen noted some years ago, the Hebrew for to behave like a prophet can also be rendered as to rave or to act beside oneself. So there's clearly overlap here. And these stories don't end with the New Testament, of course. There are vivid accounts of madness conceived of as possession, with Christ regularly portrayed as casting out demons. 7, so we're told, from Mary Magdalene alone. On one notable occasion, which we see, this is a very worn Anglo-Saxon manuscript that survives now in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Not quite stolen, but paid for, I think, on this occasion. Jesus is reported to have caused a herd of demons who were inhabiting a poor wretch into a herd of swine. And behold, the whole herd of swine ran violently down a steep place into the sea and perished in the waters. With these divine precedents, prayer and, I need to go back. That's not quite the slide I wanted. Prayer and exorcism were one remedy canvassed for cases of insanity among Christians, and suitable rites were accordingly made up by the church to permit priests to cast out the devil and his minions. And these sorts of beliefs and practices persisted for many, many years, many centuries. And indeed, in some quarters, they haven't entirely vanished even today. There was, of course, the practical question of how to deal with mental illness. And in that period, it was primarily the family that was called upon to somehow cope, sometimes with some help from the Catholic Church, which, of course, was dominant all across Europe in those years. But that sort of response, which was very haphazard and driven largely by the desire to secure your own salvation, was not, on the whole, terribly effective. And these were societies, of course, where the margin between subsistence and starvation was generally quite narrow, and where famine and disease and violence and early death were everywhere a looming threat. Madness in those years was one of a whole catalog of misfortunes which threatened people's health and happiness. So there have been some rather romantic conceptions, particularly in one, Michel Foucault, about the fate of the mad roaming in society, free and untrammeled. But in fact, I suspect that was the freedom to rot. Not shut up the life of the poor and the mad, like other dependents, was almost certainly a Hobbesian existence, nasty, brutish, and short. And things might take a much nastier turn. Many forms of illness were seen as the result of moral failings or lapses, or the vengeance of a displeased God, a notion that persisted as a respected belief even into the 19th century. For example, outbreaks of cholera in Britain and the United States led divines to call for national days of prayer and repentance because this was a visitation from God because of their moral turpitude. And even there were acts of Parliament and Congress to that effect. Obviously, the plague that carried off such a large fraction of the European population in the 14th century was often interpreted in this fashion. And madness was something that could very readily be seen in these terms, even by some of the victims whose delusions often assumed these sorts of forms. In a spirit-drenched world where popular beliefs in devils and witchcraft were fervently held, the consequences could prove quite dire. The mad, or those who were presumed to have cast spells on them to drive them to distraction, might find themselves caught up in the mania for witch hunting, which periodically erupted all across Europe in this period. This is one image of a test for witches. They're being cast into water. If they sink, they're not. But they're probably going to drown. If they float, good. Well, even nastier things are going to happen to them. Here you go. Witches being hanged and a witch finder being paid off like Judas Iscariot in the background. Or here. Another witches being cast into the flames. And thousands of people perished in these periodic spasms of fright. So that's clearly one set of beliefs that spans many, many centuries, and it doesn't die out, as it persists indeed well into the 18th century in some places. But there was, of course, here we go. So Rubens here, you can see the devils flying off. Ignatius has expelled them, and off they go. This was, of course, there are actually three versions of this, one in Genoa, one in Vienna, and one in the Netherlands. And it was a part of the Counter-Reformation. What Rubens was painting here was designed to show, you see all the distracted at the bottom of the picture, and then the devils fleeing the influence of him. The Catholic Church could perform exorcisms, and Protestants could not. So that's part of the message of this particular picture. Right. And here's actually a fairly late 18th century version in Austria where a local priest became famed for his ability to cast out demons. And again, you can see them fleeing away out of the poor, tormented person. So that's one very common set of meanings that lasts a very long time with different wrinkles. But there was an alternative tradition that had emerged even in ancient Greece. We all know modern Western medicine in some senses is descended from Hippocrates. Here's a fanciful image of Hippocrates who may or may not have been a historical figure, but his school brought into being, and then as it was developed by Galen, a Greek physician, again, a very fanciful picture of Galen, somebody who, this was a school which saw mental ills like physical ills as rooted in the body, as the product of an imbalance of the humors and of problems with people's lifestyle and regimen. And that emerged, as I say, in ancient Greece. It became very prominent in the Roman Empire. And when the Roman Empire collapsed and urban civilization disappeared pretty much in the West, those beliefs and that knowledge was largely lost. It re-emerged in Europe in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries from the Arab world, where in the Eastern Empire and then after the Muslim conquest of the Eastern Empire, this body of knowledge remained, and it began to re-penetrate into Europe at that point. So for a time, there were competing accounts of madness, religious ones and metaphysical ones, supernatural ones, but also these other claims that it was something quite other, that it was something to be understood in the same way one understood other forms of disease. And there was a long and uneasy kind of conflict between these views. For a time, the church was willing to accept that some forms of madness had a naturalistic origin, while others belonged to them. And physicians of the time went along with that. They certainly lacked the power to impose their own views. But I think by the 18th century, it's fair to say that medical accounts were beginning to win the upper hand. So we begin to enter the era from which your profession emerged, but not quite yet. Very often portraits are that we move from superstition to enlightenment, from darkness to knowledge. I don't think the replacement of God and the devil by attention to the mysterious workings of the body and the brain automatically was an unambiguous blessing for the mentally ill. Moving away from a world where they were quite literally demonized did open up the chance to view mental patients more sympathetically. In principle, it encouraged inquiries that looked to find the source of their troubles in the natural rather than the supernatural world, and to view them as fellow human beings. A vital step, of course, if we are to avoid exacerbating their sufferings by stigmatizing them. But sadly, I think, the historical record shows that very different responses are possible, and that the mere involvement of the medical profession and the use of the term illness hasn't always served to banish the problem of stigma, certainly in the past, and in many ways even today. Medical interpretations and responses to mental illness, unsurprisingly if you're a historian or if you think about matters, turn out to very often reflect and to have intensified the existing beliefs about mental illness in the societies that these physicians were operating on. So, consider one of the things that happened really starting in the 17th century, but more in the 18th century, we see the rise of some specialized institutions beginning to cope with mental illness. This is probably the most famous of all in the English-speaking world. This is the second or third Bedlam, depending on how you count, Bethlehem Hospital in London. This magnificent building, deliberately mirroring a French royal palace as a way of thumbing the nose to the French. The English still engage in that stupidity, but there we are. So you see, it's built like a palace. It's huge. It's a statement after the Fire of London, which is when this is built. It's designed by Robert Hooke, who's mostly famous in the history of science. The interior is not at all like this exterior. But people visit it, and you can see them going in to visit the patients quite notoriously. It's actually that visiting was more complicated than it sounds, because many of the visitors were the patient's relatives and were bringing them food and clothing. And it also acted as a check on what went on in the hospital a bit, so that abuse was a bit less difficult if family members were about, not to say it didn't happen. The Netherlands. I'm here, so I should talk about the Netherlands. Amsterdam, and indeed later on other Dutch cities, wanted to build madhouses, as they were called, and they devised a novel way of raising the necessary cash. Instead of relying on charity, they ran lotteries where you could win prizes. You see the prizes at the bottom here. And these went on, the tickets were sold over a very long period, and then there were occasions where the winning tickets were drawn and the rest of the money went to build the house you see behind. And here is another version of it. So this is the Dolhuis, or the madhouse in Amsterdam, which the burghers have built with the proceeds of this thing. How am I doing on time? That's a madhouse in England for the very, very rich. It was purpose-built, and it was built with an iron framework, because one of the dangers of madhouses is if they were built of wood, they could catch fire, and the patients could die. So because this was for the upper classes, it was very cleverly built, right? And it was here in the walls of these new institutions that over time, a new group of specialists, not all of them initially doctors, but in the end, most of them, and then all of them physicians, began to experiment and to work with madness. And some of the earliest experimentations, which drew on the technology of the Industrial Revolution, were quite fearsome. Here's a little device by Joseph Ghiselin, a Belgian psychiatrist. The book was published in Amsterdam, actually, in 1826, so it's quite recent. And it's a device for exposing the patient who's put into this device over the water, into drowning him, or nearly, the hope is actually nearly drowning him. He was ushered in, they locked him in the cage, and then they dropped him below the water. And then they brought him back up, they hoped, before he expired, right? So you see what I mean about technology being pretty fearsome. We all know about tranquilizers. It's very much part of contemporary psychiatry. Here's the first tranquilizer. This is a chair. It looks a bit like an electric chair, which Americans still from time to time use to fry people. One of the more delightful aspects of living in such an ultra-civilized society is that. Here, the patient is immobilized. No sound, because the headpiece is padded. No light, obviously. Arms pinioned, legs pinioned, so they can't cause the blood to rush around by moving. Their senses aren't stimulated. There is a little pot beneath them if they need to evacuate. And rush who was an American mad doctor from the early 19th century, boasted that this calmed the most obstreperous patient and rendered them tranquil. Perhaps, I mean, being threatened with a second dose of that might cause you to somehow learn to behave. So there we go. Fortunately, these formidable devices didn't last very long. Another one was a swinging chair, which Erasmus Darwin, Charles' grandfather, recommended, and various of those were constructed. But it really didn't last more than 2 or 3 decades. And instead, practices that were notable for a rather utopian optimism about what we could do for mental illness began to surface. They embodied the possibility of cure or recovery from mental illness, but also, and perhaps more importantly, for our own purposes today, they rested upon a very different and much less stigmatizing view of the mentally ill. Where an earlier generation had seen the mad as being deprived of the very quality that most distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom, namely reason. The advocates of this new approach thought that the mad retained some of that reason beneath their obvious ravings or melancholy, and that as our fellow creatures, if they were treated properly, kindly, in an environment that isolated them for hyperstimulation of society around them, it responded to them on a very individual level, it could rescue them from their state and in many cases restore them. And at the beginning of this process in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, there were quite extravagant statements about how many people could be cured. 60, 70, 80% of the most seriously mentally ill, if they were just brought to an asylum early enough, could be cured. This is, again, the iconic start of that movement in the English-speaking world, the York Retreat, founded by a tea and coffee merchant named William Tuke in York. And you can see it looks like a regular house, deliberately so. Even the windows were, they were actually of iron, so they're really bars, but they were painted to look like wood so that the impression of confinement wouldn't be there for the patient. There's no obvious barrier between the hospital grounds and the rest of the countryside. Actually, there was what they called a ha-ha, a deep ditch and a hidden wall. So when you looked out from above the hill, it looked as though you could run off. But in fact, if you tried it, you couldn't, right? So this is all a question of managing expectations, coaxing people back to sanity. If they were really good, they could take tea with Mr. Tuke himself. Okay. And this was really the start of this period of great optimism and the building of asylums, and alongside the building of asylums, the emergence of your own profession. In England, the first such organization was 1841. In the United States, where I now live, 1844. Yours a little bit later than that. But this was happening all across Europe. And it was something that was supposed to rescue the mentally ill from jails, from mistreatment, from hardship. And initially, I think it did. But what happened over time is that initial optimism was obviously vastly oversold. The new procedures, I think, worked pretty well in the original small institutions, but actually curing 80% of the mentally ill, well, if we could do that, you'd all be a very prestigious branch of the medical profession. We still can't do it, right? We can deal with symptoms, we can improve people's lives, we hope, but actual cures are very, very elusive. When they happen, we're not quite sure usually why that is. So what happened over time is every year, a proportion of patients, 50, 55%, didn't either die or recover sufficiently to be released. And that population of chronic patients just kept growing and growing and growing. And as a fraction of the whole of the people locked up in mental hospitals, it was larger and larger. And let me just show, we're a little out of order here. There we go. So here's one massive asylum. Here's one in upstate New York, just the central building. Here's still another one in Illinois. And since I shouldn't just use American examples, here's one in Vienna, later used under the Nazis to exterminate autistic children. And there's a floor plan of an English asylum, and you can see these became almost like towns. They had their own fire brigade, they had their own water supply, their own everything. Often in America and in England, they grew to as many as 10 or 12,000 patients in a single site. And individual treatment is just an impossibility. So you have this awkward problem if you're a psychiatrist. Your ancestors said they could cure 80%. Here are all these chronic patients. How to deal with that? And what happens is the victim gets blamed. The mentally ill become degenerate. They become human beings in whom evolution is run in reverse. And they're worse than savages. They're actually worse than animals because they no longer have instincts that effectively guide them to safety. And the language becomes absolutely nasty. They're called monstrosities, tainted creatures, people whose inherited defects and biological inferiority are written on their physiognomy. This slide got out of order, so here we go. You can see at a glance, these are people who are not like us. So this is terrible business. And in the United States, in the early 20th century, this led to the passage of laws. I'll give you 2 minutes, okay, and then I'll finish. I know, aware, sorry. I tend to get carried away with these things. But in the United States, it led to laws making involuntary sterilization allowable. And the United States Supreme Court in 1927 made a decision and said 3 generations of idiots are enough. The state is allowed to do this. And shortly thereafter, California's legislation was copied in Nazi Germany. And the Nazis first sterilized their mentally ill. And then they said, these are useless eaters. These are people who are just a burden on society. They're never going to get better. What should we do? And here in Tiergartengasse 4 in Berlin, the T4 program was born and authorized by Hitler. And the mentally ill were the first victims of the final solution. It was for them that the gas chamber was developed, disguised as showers. And those, about 250,000 mental patients were killed. Here's Hadamar. You see that awful black smoke? That's the crematorium. And here are the staff after a hard day's work, relaxing. I'm sorry to leave you on such a dismal note. And I have written a new book, which is called Desperate Remedies, which takes the story of American psychiatry from 1820 all the way up to, well, last year, because I wasn't clairvoyant, so I couldn't talk about this one. So that's out now, and that puts, there's another response, which is a more therapeutic response. But that one is an awful one to contemplate. So thank you so much. I'm sorry to have prevailed beyond my allotted time, but there we go. Thank you.